Hello friends, in this video we are going to see mate patterns with Rook and Knight. See here the first Knight and Rook mating pattern, the Knight on E7, Rook on H1, King on H7. Here you should imagine for black also, that is Knight on E2, Rook on H8 and King on H7. So on the queen side you see black mates with knight on d2, rook on a8, king on a2. So you should also imagine for white side also on the queen side. Now we will move on to the next position. Here you see the knight on f2, king on h1, rook g line. On the queen side it is rook b1, knight c7, king on a8 with a black pawn standing on a7. You should also imagine for white if it is given for black. If it is given for white, you should imagine for black side also. Now in this position it is n g3 and rook h1. The pawn f2 pawn is pinned by the bishop. So next we see back rank weakness mate. So with nf5, rook c8 is made here. Another mating position is n g4 with rook on 8th rank. So f2 and h2 is covered by the white knight. So it is made here. Moving on to the next position, we see there are three different type of positions are given. So in the first position we see knight f3 is supported by the pawn and rook g1 is made. And in the opposite side, knight f6 with rook e8, knight f6 is supported by pawn again. And on the queen side you see rook b2 is supported by a pawn and knight on b3 is checkmate given to king standing on b1. Now we move on to the next position. Is a common mate actually. Knight on f3 with rook g1, knight f6 with rook g8, knight c6 with rook a7, and knight c3 with rook on a2. This is a frequently occurring mate. Applying to positions these mating patterns, knight on f6, rook on g8 mate is there. So queen into h7 check, rook into h7 is forced. After rook into h7, rook g8 is mate. So this mating pattern you should remember. So next we will see another mating pattern where knight c6 of knight b5. So first queen into a6 check, b into a6, knight b5 double check, king to a8 only move, rook a7 mate. Here nc6 also is mate. nc6 and rook a7 is also mate. Now moving on to next position, we see here white plays queen g5 attacking the g8 pawn, forcing rook to g8. If h into g5, then rook h3 is mate. So you cannot play h into g5. Even g6 means queen into h6 is there. So if you place g into f6, queen h6 is mate here. So if you play, so he plays queen rook g8. After rook g8, queen into h6 check, g into h6, again rook into g8 is mate. In this position, white plays rook into h6 check with the support of bishop, So if king g8, then n6 is mate. So he has to play for rook h6, g into h6. Now comes n6 check, king to h8, rook g8 is mate. Next position is black winning position. Here black plays queen to h4, threatening queen into h2 mate. So if rook into h4, then rook g1 is mate. So he plays rook g2 only. So after rook g2, then queen into h2 check, rook into h2, rook g1 is mate. That is, if he plays king g2, then d into c3 attacking f2 is a clear winning for black. In this position, f7 pawn is pinned by the white bishop. So white plays queen into g6 check, h into g6 is forced. Now knight f6 check, king to g7. Now rook to h7 is mate. Moving on to the next position, we see rook on a2 is there. So knight f3 check and rook h2 mate is available, but the queen is supporting. So queen e1, forcing queen into queen. After queen into queen, now n3 check, king h1 is forced, rook h2 is mate. In this position, white plays knight g6 check. If black plays f into g6, then queen into h7 check, king into h7, rook h3 is mate. After bishop h4, rook into h4 mate. So he cannot play f into g6. If he plays king g8, then queen into h7 check, king into h7, rook h3 check. If he goes king g8, then rook h8 is mate. Same pattern you can see in the next game also. Here white plays queen into h7 check, king into h7, rook h3 check, king g8. Now knight g6, f7 pawn is pinned, so rook h8 mate is unavoidable. So moving to the next position, we see knight f6 and rook e8 or rook g8 mate. So now knight f6 is there, rook e8 check is there, so bishop is guarding, so queen into bishop. If b into c6, then rook e8 is mate. So knight f6 supported by a pawn, rook e8 checkmate. If king on e7. Now next mating pattern is similar mating pattern. Here knight d6, a discovered attack on the c1 rook. So if he plays knight into d6, then white wins the exchange by rook into c1. So if black plays rook into c7, then knight e8 check, king f8, knight f6 discovered check. If the king moves to e7, then rook e8 is mate. Or if the king moves to g7 from f8, then rook g8 is mate. The knight is supported by e5 and g5. Moving on to the next position, we see here N-F7 mating pattern with G line control. So here white plays rook G8 check, rook into rook, knight F7 is mate. Similar mating pattern arises in the next position. White plays queen into H7 check, bishop into H7, then knight F7 is mate here. So in this position, knight E7 check, king H8, queen into H7 check, king into H7, rook H1 is mate. So knight E7 and rook H1 mate pattern. In the next two positions, the knight position creates a back rank weakness which the attacker exploited. Here knight G4 controls the H2 square. So rook to D1 check. Now knight to G1. After knight to G1, rook into G1 check, king into G1, rook D1, rook F1, rook into F1 is mate because the H2 square is controlled. Here also it's white turn to move NF5 double check, discovered check. So if king E8 then queen E7 is mate. So he plays king to G8. After king to G8, white plays queen F8 check. If king to H7 then queen to G7 is mate. King F8, rook B8 is mate here. Rook C8, rook into C8 is mate. In this position, black plays queen G3, threatening queen into G2 mate. So F into G3 is forced now. Now black plays rook into G2 check. King to H1, knight into G3 is mate. So this mate pattern, rook G2 with pawn support and knight on G3. Here you can mate by rook also with rook G2 with the support of pawn, knight G3. So this is also another mating pattern. But rook mates here. Now we have king hunt in the final position with the same knight and rook mate pattern. Here white plays rook a5 check. If king b6, then queen into c5 is mate because the d6 pawn is pinned. So he cannot go to b6. He has to take king into a5. Now queen into c5 check, d into c5, knight c4 check, king b5, rook b6 is mate. So thank you for watching.